Alright. Now, sometimes when there's a controversial topic brought up, and sometimes when, there's a topic where people have a chance to have a different opinion on it, you hear some pretty stupid things. And, this is, for all intensive purposes, a very controversial subject, and one that, well, to say the least, has kind of got me a little bit angry, just a bit. So in late 2012, a year from now, they are planning, as you can see from the title, and you can probably put two and two together, realize what it is. They're making a movie on Chris Benoit. And, obviously, they're not going to be, making light of the two deaths. Obviously, they're not going to be, praising Benoit for being a great in-ring talent, which, you could make the argument for, but, let's get real here. There's a lot of things that I'm actually very upset about this on. Alright, now I know, even still to this day, there still are a lot of Chris Benoit fans out there, and, you have an opinion, you can like who you want, but, that doesn't change the fact of what he did. When wrestling really took the swerve from entertaining to not, and you can make the argument for, the Attitude Era, and then once the Attitude Era stopped, it was bad. A lot of this all turned after the double murder-suicide that Chris Benoit committed. A lot of this whole, bashing and bad, views on the wrestling industry, especially from a mainstream crowd that may not be a fan of wrestling, or a mainstream crowd that, bashes wrestling. You can kind of blame Chris Benoit for that. Whether you were a fan of Cena in 2006, people were praising, we need to go back to the fucking TV 14 era, but one of the main reasons WWE has changed for the better, in my opinion, you can make an argument for a more stale product, but was because of Chris Benoit. Linda running for senator, or governor, whatever the fuck she was running for, I understand that too, but one of the big flip-flops was because from 2007 to fucking 2008, there was nothing but shit. They're fucking steroid monkeys, they're all drug addicts, and that was what's being looked upon as wrestling today. And now you look at 2011 compared to 1999 or 2000, when everybody and their mother watched wrestling, and now you can't even walk down the street without somebody, if you bring up the word wrestling, that's what Hogan used to do, or I remember Stone Cold Steve Austin, but you don't get that anymore. Somebody may know John Cena, but I guarantee you, if you ask any person who's ever heard of the word wrestling, they're going to know who Cody Rhodes is, they're going to know who Dolph Ziggler is, they're going to know who Daniel Bryan is, they're going to know, even to a lesser degree, if you want to look at main event stars, they're going to know who Alberto Del Rio is, are they going to know, and you can blame WWE for maybe not showcasing these stars and not highlighting these stars. John Cena's highlighted, though, and, for some reason when you ask a wrestling fan about a wrestler, or wrestling in general, they're going to say a name like Stone Cold or a Rock, and not a name like a John Cena, and you can take that away from his talent. Personally, I think John Cena has a lot of talent, but 2008 was the turnoff. 2008 was when WWE went PG, and that's when everybody was complaining, we need the Attitude Era back. Let's have chair shots. Let's have blood. And I think sometimes in feuds, blood's a necessity to continue on the storytelling, the psychology of a feud and of a match. But when all this whole crackdown on the steroids and the headshots and all this other stuff happened, was when Chris Benoit fucking went nuts. And rightfully so, Vince McMahon has worked these guys. He does, especially back in the day. I don't think it's any secret that Vince McMahon's worked these guys to the bone, and they've been tired. But once all this happened, that was the turn, and maybe you could say, well, maybe Benoit's a martyr for showing the light. But what happens is we go from a wrestling business that's been booming, booming. They're putting out, stars like Austin, Rock, Foley, Kane, Taker, Kurt Angle, Chris Jericho, Triple H. Hell, when Benoit, Eddie, Malenko, and Saturn jumped ship, you could make the argument for too. There were so many guys back then that people knew who the fuck they were. But somewhere along the lines, wrestling started to not be as popular as it used to be. For all those who don't know, I started watching wrestling in mid-2004. And back then, even 7 years ago, 2011, 7 years ago, it was still more popular than it is today. It wasn't as popular as it was in the Attitude Era. And, the Golden Era and years before that. But it was still more socially acceptable than it is now. Notice how if you go to school, or you go to work, or you walk down the street, or you go to the carnival, or you go to the mall, or you're Christmas shopping, or whatever, you're not going to bump into a whole lot of people that still watch wrestling. Could it be for the boring product? Well, it might be, but one of the main reasons was in 2007, the news was just flashing. Chris Benoit kills his family. Chris Benoit takes steroids. Chris Benoit has headshots. So now they don't do headshots with chairs. They don't do chair shots to the head, which personally I think is a good thing because I don't want anybody else to recreate what Benoit's done. And, they're cracking down on steroids, which is another good thing. But somewhere along the lines, you can say Benoit wasn't in his mind, Benoit always loved his family, but somewhere along the lines, Chris Benoit killed his family and hung himself from his fucking weight machine. And like I said, this is a controversial topic, there still are a lot of Chris Benoit fans out there. But I don't want to see this movie made. Will I watch it? Yeah, I'll probably watch it, see how it turns out. But they don't need to showcase this anymore. If you're a wrestling fan and you love this industry, the entertainment value, the spectacle, if you love all that, then why do you want this to come out? This is just going to be shitting on a company even more than it's already been shat on. Back in the 90s, it was cool to watch wrestling. Back in the 80s, it was cool to watch wrestling. You think it's cool to watch wrestling now? You think somebody's going to, You remember when you used to be so excited for Raw and you'd run home because you wanted to see Austin or Nitro because you wanted to see Goldberg or Hogan? What do you got now? John Cena to look forward to? A lot of people are fans of CM Punk now, but what it comes down to is the fact that this is going to do nothing but make the wrestling industry look bad again. It is going to call them all juice monkeys. It is going to, blast Vince McMahon. It's going to blast all these other people. And it's going to make the wrestling industry look even worse than it already is. This is supposed to be the increase. CM Punk's coming to save the wrestling industry. But this isn't saving it. Does this story need to be told for awareness? Probably. But it's going to do nothing but make this company look bad. It's going to make wrestling in general look bad. You want to see a wrestling company in 20 years, 30 years down the line? Hogan said this once, and I forget where he heard it, but in a documentary, you can make a bunch of little mistakes along the way and you'll be fine. But when you make that one big mistake, that's when everything comes crashing down. And like I said, was Chris Benoit in his right mind? Probably not. But somewhere along the lines, you got to blame Chris Benoit. Maybe you can blame Vince McMahon for asking so much out of these guys. And you can point a bunch of different fingers. Chris Benoit wouldn't have taken steroids if it wasn't for Vince McMahon working him like an animal, doing all these shows. But somewhere along the line, you got to realize that it was Chris Benoit injecting the steroids. And you can sugarcoat it all that you want, but it was Chris Benoit that murdered his wife, his son, and then himself. Like I said, sugarcoat it. Say that it wasn't his fault. Say that he was in steroids and they worked him so hard and Vince McMahon's the bad guy. But Vince McMahon didn't take Linda's head, fucking shove her in the bathroom. He didn't take Shane and choke him out and then kill himself. This is one of the frustrations I have. This is why I'm fucking Canadian. And, I know a lot of Canadians who still respect Chris Benoit because he's a national hero. Well, fuck. How is a guy who murders his family a hero? Because he was a good technical wrestler, and he did all this good stuff, and he made wrestling look real. When he fucking committed suicide and killed his family, he didn't do anything but hurt the fucking wrestling business. Does Chris Benoit deserve a spot in the Hall of Fame? Well, I used to think so, but not anymore. At first, you can't, which my mistake too, you can't just look at his in-ring ethic. You gotta look at his life and what he's done to contribute to make wrestling a success, which is apparently something he loves. You've got to look at that and see what he's done. What has he done? He's hurt it. He's made this PG era that we all hate. They wouldn't have watered it down so much. And like I said, it is a good thing maybe it's watered down. Maybe it's a good thing these guys aren't doing that. But there's got to be some room in between, There's so many different points you can throw off in this kind of controversy. And like I said, everyone's going to have a different opinion on it. Some people are going to blame Vince McMahon. Some people are going to blame Benoit. They're both kind of at fault in my opinion, but that doesn't excuse either one of them for what's gone down. But do I respect Vince McMahon more than a Chris Benoit? You're damn right I do. And going to this movie, I've got a link of it here. It'll be in the description box as well. Going on to this movie, I guess it was based off a book called Ring of Hell, which was written by some guy who I've never heard of. And pretty much they're just going to go over what happened and all the suicide. And I don't know if it's going to be like an actor playing Benoit, or if it's just going to be a documentary, or I don't know exactly what it's going to be. I've got a link here that I'll get you guys to read if you want to in the description box. I don't know exactly what's going to go down with it. The tragedy of Chris Benoit's final days are to be retold in a new big screen biographical thriller entitled CROSSFACE. So, by Matthew Randazzo V. I don't fucking know, but link will be down in the description box if you want to read that article. And like I said, I'm sure every one of you have an opinion on it. And, I don't like to be told, well, he's Canadian, you should like him. If anything, I should be ashamed that someone like that came from my country. I have no respect for Chris Benoit. Oh no, but he was a great wrestler and he put on 5-star classics. Yeah, he's had a couple good moments. I'll never forget WrestleMania 20. But what are you going to do? If it was anybody else, if it was an actor, whether you liked him or not, what if a Emmy-nominated, Oscar-winning actor did this? Are you going to excuse it because he was a good actor? And he did great things for Hollywood? No. Why do we have that exception with Chris Benoit? I don't respect Chris Benoit. Whether you appreciate his in-ring work, which, to an extent, I'm not going to lie, some of his matches were great matches. But that doesn't excuse what he did, and I don't know how anybody can go out there and say, I still respect Chris Benoit, because how do you have respect for anybody that takes the life of a son and a wife? This has been told 1,000 times. Maybe me retelling this right now isn't good, but this makes wrestling fans and the wrestling business look like complete garbage when this kind of trash goes on. And like I said, this movie will be recreated. It's a good thing and a bad thing, because it's a good thing that people are more aware of this, but it's a bad thing because it's going to make this company look bad. And at the end of the day, you could go back to Vince McMahon, and like I said 1,000 times, you could go back to him and say, well, he was the guy working them. But it was Chris Benoit that did it. And if it wasn't for Chris Benoit, we wouldn't be in this little fucky loop. And it frustrates me. It really frustrates me that you can't walk down the street and, it's not pop culture wrestling anymore. It's not talked about like the Jersey Shore, which for some odd fucking reason. I mean, you can say wrestling is garbage, you can say you don't appreciate it, but you can appreciate a show like the Jersey Shore more than wrestling? Whether you're a fan of wrestling or not, or Jersey Shore or not, I think I'd be able to appreciate that, even though it's fake and not real. I can appreciate that more than fucking half the TV shows that are aired today. And like I said, maybe this has enlightened you. Maybe you have a different opinion on Chris Benoit. Maybe you still will bash me and dislike this video and say, no, Chris Benoit was a great wrestler. He contributed everything. And he gave his heart to this. He loved this. Obviously didn't love it that much. You know, whether Benoit was in the right state of mind, like I said, this is a touchy topic, whether Benoit was in the right state of mind or not, whether he had drugs, whether he had the head injuries worked by the Vince McMahons, the WWE machine, he still killed his family and then hung himself. Will this movie be interesting, to say the least? You're damn right it'll be interesting. And I'll be one of the first people in line to see it when it comes out, because I want to see what they do to make wrestling look even worse than it's already looked in the past number of years. I don't know what else to say. I'm frustrated by this, as you can tell. You know, they're both at blame. The guys in the back, the Vince McMahons, for working them, but they didn't ask for murder. You know, Vince McMahon's checklist was never appear in Japan, appear in fucking Tokyo, that's in Japan, whatever, appear then in Mexico, go to Europe, and then kill your family. They never asked of that. They're both at fault, but McMahon didn't kill his family. Benoit did. You know, what was that one crazy guy's name? Billy Jack Hayne. What was the guy? He made the video saying McMahon fucked Nancy. I don't know the whole story, but you get it. You know, I do recommend people, if you're a wrestling fan, to see this movie, but I don't want the masses to see this movie. I want wrestling fans to see this movie. I just don't want the mainstream real world that doesn't watch wrestling to see this, because then they're going to take one look at it and realize, oh shit, wrestling's garbage, and you'll never get it back to the way it used to be. And for people who say they should mention Chris Benoit's WrestleMania 20, they should mention that he was the Royal Rumble. Why do you want to bring that kind of stuff up? Why do you want to mention that? Why do you want to make your company look bad? You want to lose money? You want to lose sponsorships? You know, maybe the PG era is a good thing, and a lot of people are going to disagree with me on that. And yes, the booking sucks, and it's terrible, and it's boring, and it's stale, but if we're not getting guys going out and murdering their family, well, then I think it's a positive. You're all going to have an opinion on this. I'm going on for too long. I could probably talk about this for an hour, but quite frankly, I don't want to do that. You're all going to have your own opinion on it. Comment down below. Give me your thoughts. Like, dislike, and subscribe to the Gurus of Greatness, because in reality, we're great, but just try to hear me out here. I'm not interested in non-wrestling fans seeing this movie, because if a wrestling fan sees this movie, they can move forward from it and say, well, hopefully, no, nothing like this ever happens again. But if some fucking 23-year-old kid who is big into the UFC and used to watch wrestling, but now it's too fake for him, he sees this movie, it's gonna fucking shit all over it. He's gonna shit all over the wrestling business. And fuck, you know, rightfully so. But This is gonna be another just case of where wrestling looks bad, like it's always looked bad. You know, there's always been people in the past who have made wrestling look bad, and this movie's gonna do nothing but make the company on a mainstream level look even worse than it already is. It'll be interesting to see. Like I said, comment down below, give me your thoughts. That's gonna do it for this video. Peace out.